Okay, it's after 2 o'clock now, so I just wanted to welcome everyone to the Astra Solar Installer Industry Conversation. This is meant to be much more laid back, much more off the cuff, if you will. There's no presentations or anything like that. It's meant to be a lot more social and interactive, or at least as much as we can be these days through our computer screens. So I'm just going to hand it over. We have two solar installers on with us today, and I think at least maybe one or two more in the chat room too. But I'm going to hand it over at this point to Jim Funk, who is going to talk a little bit about what he does. And then after that, Burke, you'll have a chance to talk as well. And then after that, you guys can just kind of take questions as they come in. So go ahead, Jim, take it away.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jim Funk. I'm the founder and owner of Energize LLC. My background is electrical engineering. I first learned about the technology in college in 82, 83, about photovoltaic cells, and no jobs back then. So 2002 formed Energize LLC, part-time for a few years and then full-time since 2005, I believe. And we provide solar electric systems, residential, commercial, basically any kind of electric energy consuming facilities, as well as energy storage systems. Done a little bit of wind historically, but that's not really a viable option in very many cases these days, unless off-grid. So that's my background, and looking forward to helping answer any questions that come up today.
My name is Burke ONeil, and I'm co-owner of Full Spectrum Solar. I started Full Spectrum Solar in 2002 with my brother, who's also a fellow mechanical engineering alumni from UW-Madison. But we do have an electrical engineer on staff also. Let's see, we work usually within about an hour of Madison. We do turnkey installations. We have multiple master electricians and journeyman electricians and experienced installers on staff. Like Jim, we don't do any wind turbine installations, or many. Tried to repair a few.
We've got a few calls for that. Try to steer people to find or help them find the original installer, if that's possible, is the best way to go. Right.
Yeah, it can be hard to find parts because some of the manufacturers are gone also.
So what kind of questions do folks have?
Yeah, I was gonna ask. It's always hard to tell what the participants can see and what we can see here. I just wanted to let everyone know you can feel free to type any questions you have into the chat. I don't see the raise hand function here, so I'm not sure if that's an option. Or you can always just unmute yourself as well. Like I said, this is meant to be a little bit more of a free-flowing conversation. We don't want to keep it super structured or anything like that. I just kind of want to know, fellas, what sort of changes you've seen, everywhere from business to your practices due to the pandemic, good or bad. Hopefully good, but I would assume there's definitely some changes too that you're probably not super excited with. Bert, why don't you go first?
Sure. We have a COVID-19 plan that we added to our business operations. Some of the things that we're doing is we've got our crews starting, if they need to come into the shop, we're staging the start times to reduce overlap. And we've got more installers that are just going directly and clocking in on the job site. And then we do have a requirement that every time anybody's within 6 feet, working within 6 feet of anyone, they're required to wear face masks. And we have most of our office members are working from home. We did put up some additional barriers and increase our ventilation and some other provisions inside the office. So sometimes it's helpful to actually be there. And we always have to have at least one person there to receive shipments and check things in and stuff. But as far as working at customers' homes, we try to minimize the time inside we make sure that they're aware of when we're going to be in the basement making an interconnection, say, and we sanitize surfaces on the way out. We're able to do some site assessments without actually meeting in person, or just, you know, finding a time we can access the house when there's not a lot of people around. So those are, you know, some of them. We used to have a weekly in-person meeting, and then now we're doing it either through Zoom or phone calls combined with some email follow-ups on what's on the schedule. So there's been like quite a few logistical changes. Amazingly, our productivity has stayed pretty steady. There's been a couple issues with communication, but it's worked out pretty well. And overall, our business was up almost 50% last year. So it's hard to complain. Residential was up a little bit, which was surprising. I thought a lot of people would be like, hey, I'm going to wait and see what happens here before spending money on, you know, something that's not necessary. And then a commercial was really strong. We didn't have any projects that were canceled due to COVID. And, you know, we had a lot of stuff already, you know, lined up before the pandemic hit even. And those commercial projects have been really good because a lot of the work is, you know, laying out racks and blocks and things that we can do outside.
Yeah, we're obviously taking everything seriously, as Burke described. My wife and I work out of a home office, so we didn't have to transition to anything there. That made that pretty easy. But as far as meeting with customers, we haven't really had any issues, I would say, either as far as communication or anything like that goes. We've done a lot of remote site assessing for at least initial contacts, and then it's really up to the customer. And we've had definitely some customers who have been, they had a situation where they were immune compromised or something, and so they did not want to meet face to face at all, and in fact then moved projects out because of that, because of whatever challenges that they were facing. And a few people making the comment that economically they wanted to wait till things settled out. So so we have seen some impact from that, but not anything I would say really significant or overly burdensome or anything like that. We're always wearing masks. So we're doing the wipe down when we come in and when we go out, and trying as much as possible just not to have anyone around us from the household or business when we're working inside. And as Burke alluded to, most of our work is outside. So that makes it a little bit easier, and still everybody wearing masks to make sure that, especially as we learn more, that we're doing everything we possibly can to minimize the risk for also people on the crew and everything.
Yeah, that's great to know, guys. Thank you so much for that insight. We do have a question that came in from Kyle. Do you have any opinions on the vulnerability of the US electric grid to hacking or disruption? And are solar and storage a reliable way to protect a homeowner from such dangers or uncertainties?
I have no specific knowledge of the subject. I've read, I can't remember the book some customer referred me to. I did read the book about that subject from a fairly old or experienced in life person from a major network, I believe. Can't remember his name, but I'm familiar with that. But as far as knowledge of the risk of hacking, I can't provide any input on that. Certainly a battery backup system or any kind of backup power system should be able to help in the case of an outage for whatever the reason is. Of course, if you're talking about infrastructure, then it's certainly likely to be much longer duration. And so then it depends. If you have solar and battery, then you're obviously going to be able to use all the battery storage that you have, and then the solar resource that's available to add to your capabilities for backup power will vary with the time of the year and the weather and so forth. Like at least in this area of the state, Northeast Wisconsin, local weather said something yesterday or day before that in that period of time we had 3 hours of sunshine during that entire 10-11 day period. So when you're in that time of the year, then that can be a challenge, and having a backup generator even if you do have a battery, is not a bad idea. It just depends what you're trying to prepare for.
Yeah, and from our conversations that we had here yesterday, that backup or the amount of backup can definitely vary widely too. Are you talking about backing up your whole house for days, or are you talking about backing up just a few things here and there? Burke, any comments from you on this question?
No, I think Jim covered it. I'm also not familiar with any grid vulnerabilities, and most of our work being in Madison and the area, folks around here rarely have extended power outages. So we're only doing a handful of battery backup systems per year, but they can vary, from 8 or 9 kilowatt hours designed to just run a radio and, maybe a refrigerator and a couple emergency loads for a short period of time to, we've done some large systems with, 30, 40 kilowatt hours of battery backup. But even those people, if there's 10 days with minimal sun, are going to have to be cutting back. They're not going to be able to run heat pumps, and they're going to have to, if they don't have a generator, they're going to have to go sort of little house on the prairie style and wood heat or something that doesn't require or propane or gas, something that's going to require less electricity. And those really big sort of whole house battery systems can get very expensive, and unfortunately, although lithium ion battery technology's gotten a lot better, it's still very expensive for stationary applications.
Yeah, we talked about, I hate to stay on the battery topic so long and kind of beat this topic to death, but we talked about this a lot yesterday. I think it's just the batteries are kind of the hot button topic right now. And our solar installer yesterday said of the customers he was talking to, and I think this is mostly for residential, I can't speak as much to commercial, but he said, they were having the battery conversation with basically 100% of their residential customers. Now, whether or not they certainly are not installing 100% batteries, but I just kind of wanted to get an idea for you guys, like what those percentages look like. He said it was, like he said, he was talking with every one of them, meaningfully about it. And they were doing probably like almost, I think he said 7 to 9% of their installs now had some sort of battery component. So I just kind of want to know what you guys are hearing from your customers as well.
Well, we're from, like Burke mentioned, he's from the Madison area. Within an hour, we try to be within an hour of where I'm located, which is Winneconne, which is about 15 minutes northwest of Oshkosh. So we serve all the Fox cities and surrounding areas, Oshkosh, Fond du Lac, and then out into rural areas, certainly. So some folks are pretty isolated, but more commonly it's people that are, surrounding suburban and rural areas that are pretty close to the city. So outages are not that common. For years, we've had lots of requests for what about adding battery backup? And the solution typically has been a fair amount more expensive than putting in a modest sized generator. So we've often, even though we have not been selling those, we often would suggest that if their objective is met by a generator, all their objectives are met by putting a generator in, then that's historically been what people have done. And some have opted to hold off. But in probably the last few years, probably around the time that Elon Musk made his introduction of the Powerwall, even though for a lot of time we had no access to getting Powerwalls, certainly the phone started ringing asking for lithium batteries and so forth. So we've worked with a number of companies. We in fact took one grid tie home off grid, which I never thought I'd see the day in my life, but they're also the most energy frugal people we've ever met, a retired couple, and they covered all of their energy with no backup generator with a 4 kilowatt PV array. And they have a fairly sizable battery bank because of some large loads that they have, some woodworking equipment and so forth. But Otherwise, they don't use a heck of a lot of energy. But battery backup is certainly modest, and I would echo what Burke said as far as cost goes. Lithium ion, that's basically, in the last few years, that's basically all that we've done has been lithium ion, but cost is not insignificant there, and capability is getting better, just like your cell phones. They don't typically get cheaper at all, but they get more capable, and I think that's what's happening with the lithium. You're getting more storage in the same capacity in the same space, and maybe per dollar to some extent improves, but it's kind of like, in my mind, it's like PV was, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, where it's pretty early, and I expect costs will come down in the coming years, but wouldn't dare to make a prediction about how much and when or anything like that.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I think, we've got this market here, we have a fair amount of people coming at it from an environmental angle. I don't think we have 100% of people asking us about batteries or wanting to talk about it. It's probably more like 25, 50%. And most of those people, if you throw out kind of a starting number for a very small battery backup system of it adding $10,000 or more, they kind of bug out. Maybe of those 25% of our customers we talk to about batteries, 5% or so actually end up doing something. And I think it's because of the cost. And as Jim pointed out, you can get a heck of a lot more capacity if you're just looking for short outages, a heck of a lot more capacity for the money with the generator. If you're thinking there's going to be, societal issues or grid issues or like long-term kind of things where there might not be access to fossil fuels, then solar plus batteries is really the only game. So we get some people who are preppers, and then we get some people who just, they have the financial resources to, they like the elegance of batteries versus a generator, and they have the financial resources to spend a lot of money on it. I think people kind of have the illusion with lithium ion that there's been some kind of breakthrough versus lead acid. And in terms of capacity, there hasn't been a lot of, there's not like lithium ion per unit of capacity is significantly less than lead acid, which we've had all along. The big reason you're seeing lithium ion getting, making traction in automobiles is because it's getting cost competitive with lead acid at a fraction of the size and weight. But those are definitely a much smaller issue when it comes, you don't really want to fill up your basement with batteries, but space and weight isn't nearly as important as, say an automobile.
Yeah, you don't have to move your house around, right? It just stays in the same spot, so it doesn't matter if it's big.
Right. Yeah. So I've re-quoted projects I quoted, with top end lead acid batteries, 10 years ago or something, and people are kind of surprised that it's not, a quarter of the cost. It's just smaller and lighter.
We got another question in. I also just want to remind everyone, like I said, this is meant to be a little bit more social and laid back. So if you can even unmute your microphones if you want to ask questions. But I just want to get this one in too. Thoughts on the benefits of electric heating versus other sources of residential heating, considering the climate we live in Wisconsin, and is retrofitting a home for electric heat of some form a way to do better than, like, say, geothermal versus propane versus solar thermal or other forms of heat to pair with solar?
You want to go first, Burke?
Yeah, this is a tough one. It depends. It does seem like if you're building a super insulated, energy efficient house, that I guess I see few instances where I think electric resistance heating would make sense. Maybe if it's a 800 square foot passive house, with like 15-inch thick walls and German triple pane windows or something, you could get your electric use down to a point where using electric resistance heat might make sense because it just takes a hairdryer. But for most people, I think for electric heat, you'd want to look at an air source heat pump or what's called geothermal. I think ground source heat pump is more accurate because it does take quite a bit of electricity to concentrate heat from a ground source. I think it's really for a retrofit, unless you're doing like a really deep energy retrofit, it's really hard to, you know, or if you're keeping the natural gas as a backup or propane for a backup or wood heat for a backup, it's pretty challenging to find an air source heat pump that will provide the BTUs you need, you know, when it's say -7 degrees in this climate. I can say that, like, you know, if you have 1,000 square foot house that's been retrofitted, and you maybe have a pellet stove or some kind of backup, you could probably get by with, you know, an air source heat pump with electric resistance backup heat, or possibly mini splits, which are a type of air source heat pump. My brother's using one in his house, and it'll operate all the way down to -10, -12 Fahrenheit. You know, he's only getting maybe 10,000 BTUs per hour at -7 degrees. So you would either need a lot of these units, or have an unusually well insulated house to operate them. I guess I kind of rambled there. I don't know. Those are some of my thoughts. I think you kind of have to start with, you know, what is the heat loss of the house and what would it take to get it to a point where you could meet those needs with some type of heat pump. I think the amount of photovoltaics you would need to run electric resistance heat to heat a house would be kind of absurd. Take up a lot of area. Maybe if you're in a rural area and you've got a utility who does a yearly net metering true up. There's just a lot of things to consider. I've thought about it for my house because I'm paying in actual natural gas cost about $120 a year, and I'm paying $240 a year for the luxury of being connected to MG&E. But it's not a trivial issue switching my house to an air source heat pump. I've already got HVAC ducts, so putting in a bunch of mini splits is challenging. Yeah, I don't know if I'm going to sell the house in a few years. There's just a lot of things to consider, and I've kind of spent a lot of time trying to think about it for my own house, and you know, I'm using an incredibly low amount of natural gas. I think most people are using a lot more, so the challenge would be even greater.
I would echo most of everything that Burke has said there. The focus on efficiency and insulation, air sealing, all that's very important. I'm not familiar with exactly how Focus Energy is operating these days. Last I checked, they had switched the program around some, so I don't know if how easy this is, but they used to offer consultation services, and you may have paid something for that, and also somebody coming and doing an air sealing test and maybe some infrared scans and things like that to help you identify what are the most effective things that you can do to improve the efficiency on your home as far as heating and cooling. And also experts from Focus Energy. There are people that work in the Focus program that can help with identifying, you know, how well is this or that type of a heating or cooling system going to work out for you, and considering your specific home. So it does vary, like Burke said, based on the specifics. One thing that Burke touched on that's very important is the net metering. You're heating in the dead of winter, most of your demand would be there with electricity, and you don't have much solar. So if you're like most Wisconsin residents who are with an investor-owned utility, they net meter by month, and any excess beyond what you use in a month, you're getting a lower rate, somewhere between 2 and 4 or 5 cents per kilowatt hour versus maybe 12, 13, 14 cents a kilowatt hour for your retail rate. So to try to offset that really would only be effective if you had a utility that does an annual netting, or just lets it float out there for residential. But otherwise, you may have other motivations for wanting to do it. Like Burke mentioned, some folks, you have very high fixed costs with, say, to have natural gas period before you ever pay for anything. And that's happening with electricity too. as far as the fixed fees go. I personally have been very interested in using ground source heat pump when we would plan in the future sometime to do a major remodel here. And so I think it's a very good technology to use, but I've also, for meeting with customers, heard feedback from customers that varies all over the place in how happy or surprised they are with. Very many people seem to be surprised with how much electricity their system's consuming. And if that's because they didn't listen or because the system's not performing the way they understood it should be performing.
I think
don't know the answer
there's
to
a lot of
that.
bad marketing out there, honestly. I've looked at like some of the presentations that are coming from geothermal providers, and it's just real market stuff. You know, they talk about it saving energy, but they're comparing and money, but they're comparing it to a scenario the customer doesn't even have, which would be, you know, they're comparing it to electric resistance. I just think there's a lot of disinformation, and that's part of the problem with geothermal ground source heat pumps.
Yep, I definitely have seen customers that are in that situation. I was trying to be nice.
Yeah, sorry. I just have a hard time when.
Yeah, I'm curious to know, like, so my home actually has a pellet stove as well, and we, you know, it's a pretty simple house. I think it's maybe 1,600 square feet, and the basement, which is where the pellet stove is located, stays very nice and warm in the winter. And I don't think we heat really with propane or with natural gas or whatever, any of the lower level of our house. But it is hard to get that heat to, you know, rise up onto the main floor. But I'm wondering, like in a situation like mine, and sadly, I do not have solar, would it make sense for maybe to, you know, I don't know if retrofit is the right word, because it wouldn't be a complete retrofit, but would it make sense for someone like me who already has something like that in place to maybe do like the top floor, like with electric heating?
I would certainly look into it with, I think with a house that's small, the cost of putting in geothermal is going to be really outrageous. You'll never recoup your cost, even if it works as well as it should. But you might be able to, if you can count on having that pellet stove sort of as a backup on really cold days, you might be able to use mini splits, or even, I think we're slowly getting better air source heat pumps that'll operate at lower temperatures for central systems. It'd certainly be worth looking at it. If you're anything like in my boat, I would probably pay a little bit less overall with a heat pump, electric heat, than what I'm paying for the combination of natural gas and the fixed fees. So you could certainly, you know, run the numbers, you know, figure out, you know, what the heat load is and what equipment you'd have to put in. I'm guessing that economically, unless you're sure you can ditch the gas hookup fee, it's not going to pencil out. I think
Sure.
that's what a lot of people run into, is that even with a good heat pump, the heating part isn't going to save you any money versus natural gas, and it's only if you can get rid of that fixed fee.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because I'm sure I'd be very surprised even in the winter if our you know, our gas fee matches our connection fee. So that's really
the
good
electricity to run your heat pump is going to be, even if you get a coefficient of performance of 4 or 5 out of it, is going to be just as expensive as what you're paying for the actual natural gas sans hookup fee or connection fee. So it wouldn't be economically rational. Maybe if you're offsetting that electricity that you're, you know, diverting from burning natural gas with renewables, you could make an environmental argument for it. Yeah.
Interesting. Really cool.
Do
we have any other questions from the audience? Oh yeah, go ahead.
One other thing in there, Sam, is part of the reason I was thinking about doing this is, and it's kind of comment to the area that I typically work in, is that, well, there's certainly a fair number of people that are, one of their motivations is for environmental benefits. A fairly common thing here is that a lot of folks are more independently minded. they have strong feelings about being told where they're going to buy something and how much they're going to pay. As far as monopoly utilities and so forth, there's a fair amount of independently minded folks there that would prefer to be at least improving their independence from the utility. And that's one of the things, even in my mindset, that's one of the, besides technical interest, the fact that I can generate my own energy for the heat that I get from a geothermal system is a benefit, but it is a very important thing to understand as far as how much you need, because solar and heating, no matter what technology you're using for the heating, still is not really a very good fit. So having something else, like Burke mentioned about wood heating or pellet stoves, probably would be worth considering. And one thing I would say, if I was either building or major renovations to a home, maybe even less significant modifications to a home, is I would find a partner from the Focus Energy program, a professional that's not selling you things, but is a professional and expert in all the home science to do with air sealing and the different technologies of heating and cooling and insulation and construction that affect the homes or other buildings energy consumption, because it can have a huge impact. I mean, I've just worked with a customer starting last year, and he's doing several multiple additions now. And his geothermal experience was that it was probably a challenging home, but the design worked out okay for heating capacity, but it doesn't even have enough capacity to provide the cooling for the home, which is a kind of a rough situation to be in. It's not an easy thing to modify once it's been installed. So go ahead, Sam.
Sure. Yeah, no, these are all great points. I don't want to monopolize the conversation here, so I just want to see if we do have any questions from the audience. Like I said, you can either type it into the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and just ask us the old conventional way. Looks like we have another question here. In case of installing a PV system, how difficult is it to add an EV charging station at a later date? Burke, I know you've done a few. I know Full Spectrum has done a few EV installs now, but yeah, how difficult is it to kind of add it on after the fact?
Well, most of the EV chargers that we install are independent. We do some. Solar Edge has a combination inverter EV charger, and we've installed a handful of those, but for the most part they're independent. So it's installing a photovoltaic system and adding an EV charger later shouldn't be an issue as long as your electrical panel is adequate. Usually if you have a 200 amp or larger electrical service, there's capacity to add at least say a 40 amp level 2 charger. If you have only a 100 amp panel and you already have an electric oven and air conditioning, if you do the load calculations, you're probably going to be exceeding the capacity of that panel. You know, so you might want to, if you think you're going to do an EV charger down the road, it might be worth talking to your solar contractor, because they may be like, hey, it'd be nice to put in, you know, 10 kilowatts and you've got the roof area and the load, but your electrical panel's not quite there. And, you know, maybe that's a time to spend $1,000 and just put in a larger electrical service and electrical panel to make tying in the PV and a future EV system easier. But for the most part, they're independent. If you already have a PV system, you can independently address the electrical panel and installing a EV charger.
Yeah, I would echo that. The same. Ours, the ones that we've done for EV charging have been independent ones, and very good suggestion about always, if you might want to be adding the car just for the PV standpoint, future PV you might need is talk about those things with the solar installer, because then they can make things easier to add on in the future, or it can be decided that it makes sense to do certain things, like Burke said, to do that at the same time, because in some cases, depending on the utility, there's going to be things they're going to be changing anyway, and you don't want to end up changing it for the solar and then come back later and now you've got something else to change because of the EV going in where it could have been done at one time for the same or not much more money. So that's always good to talk about what might be in the future plans. Sometimes it's kids moving out of the house, sometimes it's adding an EV. So whatever that future happens to be.
Good point. Good point. Excuse me. I had a question actually too. So I'm curious. You know, I've been thankfully at Renew here for I'm going to be entering into my third year, and in just that short period of time, I've seen the efficiency of panels just like going up almost like exponentially. And I'm kind of curious. So my particular home, like I said, we don't have solar yet. Maybe yet is the operative word. My house, the roof slopes kind of east to west, but more specifically slightly southwest and northeast, maybe 2 degrees or so north of due east. And I'm curious to know, it's not that part of the roof is the only part that isn't shaded. The part that faces, like I said, slightly northeast. How difficult is that going to be now that the panels are becoming so much more efficient and we have, more efficient microinverters and optimizers and things like that? How difficult is that now? Because I know, like I said, just 2 or 3 years ago, that situation got kind of dicey.
And efficiency wise, as far as panels go, definitely huge change over the years. When we installed our home system was 2006 and the panels were 180 watts. Those panels are a little bit smaller than current common residential 60 cell modules, but not a big difference, but so 180 watts there. And the modules that we're installing, typically we're installing higher efficiency modules. We've done a fair amount of Sanyo, which became Panasonic. Did a Sun Power. At that time, you had to be a dealer for them, and I always try to avoid being pushing a particular product, so didn't stick with that. But the last 6 years or so now, coming on 7, we've been installing mostly LG, and LG's modules are about 10%. Their standard product is about 10% more efficient, meaning you get about 10% more watts in the same space. And then they have a premier product, basically, that's another 10% better. And they just have some higher efficiency ones coming out now. That's 395 watts in a 60 cell module. So, I mean, basically what that gets a consumer is more watts in a given space. So if you have plenty of roof space, I wouldn't say it's necessarily a good idea to get the most efficient because there's obviously a cost with that. Unless you're trying to save space for the case of, what if you want to have some space available for that future EV or something that you don't want to put the PV in for that just yet. So there are advantages to it. That's why they offer different levels and different companies all have their own efficiencies, but the change in efficiency as far as what for a consumer is watts per square foot or how many kilowatt hours per square foot you can get out of a system, and that's changed tremendously. It hasn't been a fast change. It's not like something just happened, but the change over the years has been quite significant when you look over that duration of time. And the east-west, we have lots of customers that don't happen to have an ideal south-facing, ideal pitched roof. And so we've installed systems, and one I can think of that we have monitoring on from, I think, 2014 in De Pere that has east, west, and south-facing roofs that the customer did because that's how many kilowatt hours they want to generate. And they're off axis a little bit towards the west. Their south roof is a little bit west to south. But all of those things, all those roofs contribute. The worst one is the west one because their west is actually a little bit north of west. But it's a neat monitoring system to see because you can see the profiles of each one has its own inverter. And so you can really see how those profiles kind of fit together. And as far as for battery backup, that's kind of a nice thing to have, or if somebody was off grid, nice to have the different orientations there so that you're getting a little flatter profile throughout the day, spreading that generation out throughout the day instead of having a big peak in the middle of the day that you can't possibly use, perhaps, if you're again in a battery backup situation or off grid.
I'd mostly echo what Jim said, but are you an MG&E service territory?
I am an MG&E service territory.
Yeah, West can actually work out really well. You might produce 20 or 25% less power, but the power you produce will be worth 35% more if you sign up for time of use metering. So we've got a lot of systems that are doing really well. Did you say the West was more shaded?
No, yeah, the West has like 3 silver maples in front of it. So it would just be morning time energy gathering, which I know is not as good, especially if you go to, well, I guess really only if you go to time of use, right, for that matter. But yeah, it's the east side.
Well, if somebody, if there is somebody looking at east-west, they might consider the time of use. A lot of our customers, it would be sort of a break even without the solar, but if you model the solar production, it's a 30%-ish boost depending on the exact orientation and the slope of the roof. But east is fine too. The panels are a little bit cooler. Theoretically, you should produce a little bit more power than facing west. And I'd probably just stick with the standard metering if you're going to cover the whole east side of the roof. And regarding efficiency, just real quick, I guess I'd say most of the 60 cell modules we're installing, the lowest efficiency modules that we're installing are 320 watts in what was like a 180 watt panel 10 years ago. And then we also do Panasonic and sun power for cases where people really need to maximize the power in the space.
That's great. Yeah, it's super interesting. I guess I'll just have to call Brent and have him come out and take a look at my roof, right, Burke?
Yeah.
Had another question come in about net metering. This is actually very timely. This is net metering as it incorporates with battery storage, though. Do you know? I know each utility's net metering policy changes. Just regular net metering policy changes from utility to utility. But in the areas that you both work in, do you know how your utilities are incorporating those projects that have battery storage into net metering?
You want to take that one, Jim?
Well, where I operate from, we have 3 different investor-owned utilities within probably a mile or 2 of where we're located. So that makes it fun. Everybody's got their own little slants on rules. One of the more challenging ones is We Energies, because they still require a separate meter for all the solar goes through a separate meter, and then they net the 2 meters together. And so to do a battery backup with that can be challenging equipment wise. But if you're going in new with that, then you can have the meters wired together in series. That's something Renew could work on. I probably have brought it up at some point in the past, but to get We Energies out of that mode of requiring the second meter, since their other part of their company, WPS, doesn't require 2, and I don't think any other utility in the state, major one anyway, requires a separate meter for solar. That's added expense for not really not a benefit to the consumer for sure. But as far as the battery backup goes with that, so their rules even seem to be evolving, at least working with We Energies. We've had different requirements put upon us just from one project to the next, it seems. I have at one point just had to say no to them, and I maybe was able to move forward based on that, but I think it's because the engineer was retiring. So maybe he didn't feel like putting up a fight over it, but just need to make sure the details are understood depending on who the utility is. But typically speaking, when you have a battery, assuming this is a battery backup type system for the question. So as far as net metering impacts go, you're only generating the same amount of energy. The fact you have a battery doesn't change that, but there may be cases where that battery could be used on a daily basis because of what the utility's net metering is. Adams Columbia Co-op is also not far from here, which I don't think we've ever installed for, although we've done a lot of site evaluations, especially long ago. because their net metering is, once it's exported, it's wholesale rate, period. There is no banking it for the month or week or day or anything. And so in that case, having a battery that can provide backup power, but also can help you with the net metering, because you could have that, the equipment has gotten quite sophisticated where you could program it so that you would drain that battery, say in the morning, for an hour or two to basically empty the bucket, so that in the middle of the day, when you'd otherwise be exporting a bunch of energy to the utility and getting a low rate for that, you can put that energy in your bucket in your battery that you've emptied, not completely, but that you've made room for, and then you can use that energy in the evening, and thereby you're saving all of that at retail. So if you're going to get a battery anyway, that's a way you can use the battery for more than one thing that adds value to you, and as a way that you can work, help you to work around maybe some restrictive things that your utility or electric provider have with their net metering.
Yeah, I haven't been the project manager on a battery backup system for years, so I'm a little rusty on it. But the understanding I got from my residential project managers is that the utilities seem to have an issue if you're AC coupling the batteries, like they want to add the AC capacity of the batteries to the AC capacity of the system. So you can run into issues there with being over their 20 kilowatt in the case of Alliant net metering limit. But the systems we're installing, Generac and SolarEdge, are DC coupled, so we haven't had that issue yet. And I think in the last 2 years, we've installed like 6 or 7 battery backup systems. So it does feel like every time you approach the utility, there's some new unwritten additional requirement, and batteries just kind of make it more complicated and more likely that they'll get some new engineer in there that has a problem with something that no other utility or engineer or anybody in the universe has a problem with. So I always recommend getting your application in early and get all your documents in a row, because the utilities seem to be using any excuse they can to make this difficult.
Yeah, and I think we should point out here, and guys, please correct me if I'm wrong, but this would probably really only come into play in like a commercial installation, right? If you're a residential, if you have a residential solar system with a backup, you're probably, for the most part, not going to be running into net metering limits too much. Is that correct?
What Burke was describing, that applies to residential. I would suspect, and pretty much all my comments were based on residential.
Yeah,
sure.
I think you need to be careful, and look at how they count the net metering limit. And if it's if they're going to count batteries in an AC coupled system, and that's what your installer is specifying, and you end up with 23 kilowatts AC, that's going to change your economics dramatically. So you really need to make sure you're not exceeding, by whatever weird definition they use, the net metering limit.
I suppose you're right. Yeah, if you're on a utility that only has a 20 kilowatt net metering limit, and you're maybe doing like several, like a full home, society blows up, you have to stay, support yourself for days or weeks or months. I guess, yeah, you definitely could get into a net metering limit there.
Well, I mean, we've got a lot of large suburban homes that we're installing like 15 kilowatt systems AC. So it's a pretty dang minimal battery backup that would put you over 20 kilowatts.
It's definitely not out of the question. Thank you for correcting me there. I appreciate it. That's why you guys are here. We got another question that just came in. This is on safety during installation. Do you think self-retracting lifelines are a good option for lower sloped pitch roof applications? And do you use them in the field?
Is this like somebody looking to install a system themselves, or?
I'm not sure. This is a question from Thomas. Thomas, you can unmute if you want to provide a little more insight here.
We use a lot of them in our installs, commercial and residential.
Do you always use them? I guess maybe is a better question to ask.
We're supposed to always use them.
Okay.
The policy to always use them, to always be tied off.
And is that your own policy, or is
100%
that a requirement?
What's that?
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Is that your own policy, or is that like a state requirement or something?
OSHA requirement, anything where you can fall more than 6 feet, you're going to have some type of fall protection. Yeah. Especially in the winter, I'll even go out to sites and be very adamant about our guys being tied off. And the self-retracting units are a lot more easy or manageable to use than just having extra set of ropes all over the roof.
Jim, anything to add to that?
Yeah, we've used a mix of that. People seem to have different people will have different, people working on the roof will have different opinions of what they prefer with that. But it's definitely a requirement, whether you're working in the industry or you're working on it for your own house. If you chose to take that sort of a thing on, I would definitely recommend that you use a fall protection system, no matter how hazardous you might think it is, because falling even just 6 feet could put somebody in a wheelchair. So it's just not worth taking any kind of a chance to not use it. And whether it's retractable or not is up to you, and how much you're going to do it. Fairly expensive probably for someone who's going to do it themselves, maybe versus a lifeline. And you do got to be careful not to step on a rope. It's like the lumberjacks up north and the shows they put on, and they're doing the log rolling thing. That's how it is if you step on a rope or a wire on a roof. So lots of hazards when you're working on a roof, and definitely need to have some sort of safety line, and whatever particular person is comfortable with, as long as it provides the protection. Mainly try to make sure you're using things that will keep you from even getting to the edge of the roof. Not just that are going to protect you from hitting the ground, but we try to always just make sure people are operating in a way by procedure and with their equipment to make sure it's impossible to fall off the roof.
Sure. So just to clarify, you require those regardless of the roof pitch.
Yeah, that's OSHA, like Burke said, that's a requirement.
Okay, great. That's good to know. Any other questions from the audience? We still have about five to 7 more minutes, so we still have some time. I just, in case we run out of time or I forget, just want to thank you both for being on here. This is really great information for our attendees to have, and I'm really glad that you're both able to do this. So I just want to say thanks again. And it looks like we did have another question that came in. This one is, in the case of a ground mount PV system, is there a rule of thumb, excuse me, let me start over. In the case of a ground mount PV system, is there a rule of thumb for how close the panels should be installed to the home? Or is it just a matter of mitigating losses in transmission, or I assume probably getting the right location for maximizing your solar output?
I can give a first response to that. There is no limit or anything like that. It is a matter of mitigating the losses. So there's no technical limit to how far you can go, but certainly the farther you go, like any electrical circuit, if you keep the same size wire and you go further, you're going to have more losses. So we always try to size our wire a bit heavier gauge to minimize those losses as much as possible. There's always a trade-off for cost, of course. And it's also a factor of how one might configure a system as well, because how you string together modules, if you are using a string inverter, whether with optimizers or safety devices that code requires under each module, going with appropriately long string will mean you're at a higher voltage, and that would give you less voltage drop. But then otherwise, it's just sizing the wire correctly so that you do not have any kind of excessive losses there. But one other thing I wanted to throw in on that is that in some cases, it has made sense where we put an inverter on a ground mount system right out there by the array and then run AC in. But if you're going over a long distance, that's at a lower voltage. And so that is a bit of a challenge versus doing a higher voltage DC, which can be up to 600 volts, and that's beneficial for transmitting power.
Sure. Sorry, I think I may have misphrased the question. The question was, how close can it get to a house?
Oh,
Like, is there a maximum distance that it needs to be, or a minimum distance, I should say, that it needs to be away from the house?
I would say as close as you can tolerate it. I mean, if it's right on top of your, if it's 5 feet away from your house, it's going to be an eyesore, and you might want to question whether you could fit the panels on the roof of the house. I can't think of any minimum. The zoning folks might have an issue if it's but all the customers that I've ever dealt with always want to have it as far away as possible. And then, when we're looking at using 1/0 welding cable or a boost transformer or something, because it's 800 feet away, then they sort of, what about 200 feet? They bring it in. Yeah, I don't know. At some point, like if it's going to be right on the house, I think I would maybe just do a lean-to structure or a solar awning or something. Because I think most people don't want a large sort of, as much as we love the look of photovoltaic modules, they don't necessarily want to look right at the back of them out a window or, trip over them. We have done some solar pergolas, where it's kind of a decorative shade structure, and some of those have been connected right to the house. So that might be an option if you want to keep it really close. That would also be aesthetically appealing.
Would that be like a solar carport, if you will?
Yeah, or a solar carport, or a fancy garden shed that's got sort of an optimal roof pitch or garage, any of those kind of things. But I think if you're doing if you've got a driven pile rack, it's semi-industrial, and you'd probably want to have a little bit of distance for aesthetics without it being such an excessive distance that you're way up, you're upsizing cables to, keeping a copper mine in business.
Jim, anything to add there? I know you have I've seen your carport, or I've seen a carport that you've done in, I think it was Appleton. And so yeah, it definitely is. Those more creative options are certainly on the table.
Yep, that one was a commercial, but yeah, tying it into if you want it to be close, tying it into the structure or almost tying it in, that can be a way it can look nice, whether it's on the driveway side in a carport or just a decorative landscape feature. We've definitely done those.
That's great. Okay, any more questions? We're almost up against the clock here, but still another minute here if there's any last questions from any folks. If there's not, I just want to thank both Jim and Burke again for being here, and also thank you to all the folks that tuned in today to learn more about solar and
yeah, great questions.
All questions of our solar installers. Yeah, thank you guys both really very much.
Thanks, Jim.
All right, take care now.
All right, bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Spending time with us. I want to also thank Andy and Joel and Chuck and Ben for being our panelists and spending time with us. And thanks very much. We'll see you.